Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Joe Lombardo, who is with what's your organization?
Well,
Bethlehem Neighbors.
nationally, I'm the coordinator of United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, and I'm also a founding member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace in the Capital District.
Great. So, how long has Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace been in existence?
Well, we started right before the Iraq War, which started in 2003. So it's been going for about 21 years.
Wow. So, Joe and I are going to talk about the proliferating demonstrations that are happening on college campuses all across the state. So I just want to say one thing before we start. You guys haven't seen me in a while. I haven't done much. I had an appendix that burst, and I was in pretty bad shape for a while. So I'm back. So Joe, uh, tell us a little bit about your understanding of the demonstrations that are going on.
Well, I'm glad you're back, Cynthia. I'm glad you're feeling better. Um, I'm not a student anymore. I was a student once during the Vietnam War period, and this is a little bit reminiscent to what went on then when, for instance, after the Kent State shootings that took place, all the colleges and campuses all throughout the country went on strike and had large protests. And the protests on the campuses have been going on since uh, October, early October when Israel invaded Gaza in what the International Court of Justice has called a probable case of genocide. So they've been protesting, and it's brought a lot of new young people into the movement. I saw that at our recent UNAC conference we had a couple of weeks ago. We had hundreds of people there, and I would say more than 50% were young, were youth, and that's a new thing in the anti-war movement. Uh, and many of these students come from the various campuses. So there have been protests on the campuses, and the government has been trying to shut them down. And so there were cases when the presidents of various colleges and universities were called in front of Congress to explain how they can allow these quote unquote anti Semitic protests on their campuses. And the president of Harvard was called in front of the Congress, and the president of University of Pennsylvania was called in front of the Congress, and they were both pressured to stop these demonstrations and were both kind of forced to resign from their positions as president of these prestigious universities. And on April 17th, the president of Columbia University was called in front of the Congress because there were protests on Columbia University. And the president of Columbia University is a real pro Zionist and anti Palestinian person. And she had expelled professors who expressed sympathy for Palestine. She had expelled organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Palestine from her campus, but it hadn't stopped the protests. So on the day she was going to speak to Congress, it was called in front of Congress in this McCarthyite type hearing, um, the students on her college took over the college. They set up an encampment right in the quadrangle and to protest, to keep an ongoing protest on their campus for Gaza. A lot of it has been led by Jewish students, and it should be noted that Columbia University in the city of New York the city of New York has the highest concentration of Jewish people of any area, including Israel, in the world. And yet, this is where demonstrations have been going, sometimes 10, 12 demonstrations a day. I keep in touch with this because through UNAC, I put out the emails to our New York UNAC list of what's going on in New York. So they took over the campus. When she got back from Congress, she called the police. The police brutally pushed the people out of their tents, tried to break them down, but they have continued. They locked the gates of Columbia University and won't let people onto Columbia. The they canceled the classes and told people they had to do virtual learning because they were afraid of people seeing these protests or joining these protests. And so this is what happened at Columbia. And there's been a big crackdown now, but the demonstrations have grown on Columbia, and they not only have grown on Columbia, they have now spread. The last time I looked, to about 33 other colleges and universities, including Yale and Harvard and MIT and University of Southern California and Berkeley and many other NYU, many other schools all around the country. And this is a very wonderful event.
What happened to the First Amendment?
Well, this is a good question. They've been cutting back on the First Amendment for quite a while, probably since, well, for a long time, but probably seriously since the Ukraine war. They didn't want people to know the other side of what's going on there. So they canceled, um, uh, news media that we were able to see in this country in the past, such as Russia Today or Sputnik or Press TV, which comes out of Iran, or the various Chinese news media. They canceled it so we wouldn't know what's going on. I myself am involved in a little bit of a case because Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, after having a, an Israeli citizen who was pro-Palestinian, was banned from using our own library facilities. Imagine that, a library where freedom of speech is supposed to be important. They banned organizations for what they say. As a result, I'm running for the library board in Bethlehem now to try to get on the board and try to be a thorn in their side or to change their policy to allow democracy. But this is happening all over, and it's been happening on the colleges for a long time. Professors such as Norman Finkelstein and others who have taken pro-Palestinian positions have been expelled from teaching in colleges. College campuses have been massively upping their security and not allowing non-students onto the campus, not allowing meetings on the campuses, not allowing freedom of expression in the classroom. And so I think there's a real curtailing of civil rights and First Amendment rights in this country. Um, and that's one of the things that our movement has to fight right now. At our UNAC conference recently, we had a panel on this, attacks on our movement, because there are people in our movement who have had the FBI come to them and threaten them and have been charged with crimes simply for saying, that they don't like the Ukraine war, for instance, and they are being accused of being Russian propagandists, and they're saying this is a crime. Or Julian Assange, simply for telling the truth. We want to put him in jail for 175 years to make it clear to every single journalist that you either say what the State Department wants you to say, or you will not have, or we will put you in jail and you will not have the right to say anything. So there is an attack on First Amendment rights.
So Scott Ritter and I have discussed, previously, with the proliferation of demonstrations going on, when the Ukraine war started, many Jewish people did not speak up against the Nazis in Ukraine, and I find that a little little strange that people should be silent on the Nazis in Ukraine, but when they speak about Netanyahu's policies, they're labeled terrorists or whatever. You know, the silence from the Ukraine war is not happening now. What do you think?
Well, I think part of the problem with Ukraine was um, uh, it was so badly censored in the West what was going on in Ukraine that people did not know. When people like me, who have been to Ukraine a couple of times and seen Nazi demonstrations, torchlit demonstrations with people with swastikas and demanding hang the Russians from the trees and saying things like and desecrating Jewish cemeteries and doing all this kind of stuff, it's not known and it's not believed. And I think that's a problem. With Palestine, it was a little different because with Palestine and Gaza, people saw on their TV screens and on their social media feeds what was going on, and they couldn't believe it. This was clear genocide, violation of uh, um, uh, war rules of war, war crimes. Any war you're supposed to let civilians leave. They have not let those civilians leave. In fact, they've targeted civilians, targeted schools, they've targeted mosques. The Columbia University thing is happening, but every single university and school in Gaza has been a target of Israeli bombs and has been destroyed. They can't go to school. And so that's why it's right the students are protesting here. So much of this happened right before our eyes, and people reacted to it. Part of the reason, part of the thing that the traditional anti-war movement and those of us who understand Ukraine and have seen what has happened have to do is draw the connections. It's the same group of people that are supporting Zionism and supporting fascism in Ukraine. It's the United States and the Europeans. It's the people that have always been the colonial powers, the people who um, uh, who uh, uh, supported the slavery. These are the people, and they can't, so people are reacting to it. And we have to say that it's the same people doing the thing. They're not right in one sense and wrong in the other. And we have to make that connection between NATO and white supremacy and colonialism and US domination and imperialism with Zionism. And that's what we're doing. And more people are getting to understand that.
So if these demonstrations gain more steam and it keeps on going and there's more colleges and more people in the streets protesting, ultimately, what do you see as the outcome of this First Amendment issue?
Well, it's more than a First Amendment issue. It's an issue of Palestinian rights. It's an issue of democratic rights, that Palestinians have a right to a democratic country. It's a fight against genocide. It's more than First Amendment. They're using the First Amendment as a tool against us and saying it's all anti-Semitism, so we have a right to ban everything that we don't like. And that's not true. But there was another time in history when Colombia rebelled, and that was in 1968 when they tried to clear out houses in the Harlem neighborhood that surrounds Columbia so they could make a new gym. And the people in the community protested against that, and they were joined by students. And this was also at the beginning of the Vietnam War. And the students went and took over many of the buildings in Columbia University in 1968. Uh, Columbia called in the police, and the police violently attacked these demonstrations, club wielding police. People's heads were split open, and many were arrested, and many were expelled during that period. But it didn't stop the demonstrations. The demonstrations grew, and they grew to other campuses and to other colleges. And 2 years later, the student movement was so large and the anti-war movement was so large that when students came out in Kent State, they called the National Guard, something that Kathy Hochul, our own governor, has threatened to do towards Columbia. They called out the National Guard, and the National Guard fired on unarmed students and killed 4 of the students and wounded many others. And then a couple of days later, they did the same thing in Jackson State, a black college in the South. After that, every school in the country went on strike. They stopped the strikes. And then we had a huge march in Washington, which was the biggest march ever in Washington. 1 million people marched in Washington. And they could no longer conduct that war. And it pushed back against the attacks on democratic rights on the colleges. I'm hoping that we're starting to see this happen again. But we're starting to see it happen again in a different context. It's the context where the US is losing power all around the world. Imperialism is being questioned and challenged, where the US and its NATO allies are losing their war in Ukraine, where millions are coming out and seeing what Zionism and imperialism are really about in Palestine, and where economic structures such as the IMF and the World Bank are being challenged. So, in that context, this student movement and the general movement in the communities for Palestine right now can have a much bigger effect and perhaps make the kinds of changes in society that we need if we want to see a peaceful world and we want to see the end of poverty and more democratic rights and a different kind of society. So I'm hoping this is the start of that kind of movement. And that's why they're afraid. They're afraid that these campus rebellions are happening right before graduation ceremonies. They're afraid that every one of those graduation ceremonies will turn into a protest for Palestine. It's happening right during the election campaign, where masses of people are seeing what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which they've known for years, but right now the Democratic Party and what the Biden administration is really about, and they're afraid that that's going to cause them to lose. And they're afraid that the whole thing might be up for grabs. The whole society might be up for grabs. And that's why they are cutting back on civil liberties to stop people from speaking. No longer can they say that the US is the land of democracy, because it isn't anymore. We have imprisoned the greatest proportion of our population of any country in the world in our prison systems. Uh, we have a great diversity between the rich and the poor. People, young people, don't see any future for themselves. We need basic change. And all of this fills into that concept of getting the basic change and changing the kind of society we are, and stopping putting 60 cents of every discretionary tax dollar into the military and start letting it be used for libraries and schools and education and to fight poverty and housing and healthcare and all the things that we need. So this really has a very bright future, the student movement. This is the beginning, hopefully, of a real big change in our society.
So do you think there'll be massive crackdowns on the demonstration? You feel kind of optimistic about the whole thing.
Well, yes, yeah, there will be crackdowns, and there are crackdowns. Just before we got on, I saw a big crackdown at Southern California University. At Southern California University, their valedictorian of the graduating class was a Muslim woman. And so she was supposed to give the valedictorian speech, and they told her she can't because she's Muslim and that will be too provocative. This is the kind of society we live in today. If someone was Jewish, they wouldn't tell them they couldn't give valedictorian speech. We live in a society where there's tremendous crackdown right now on freedom of speech, but the crackdowns by the police and perhaps the National Guard are getting worse towards the demonstrators, are getting more heavy-handed every single day. And this is what we will confront. But when they do this, they don't win. They do this because they are unable to fight on a field of ideas. So they turn towards repression, and that always leads to resistance to that repression and always exposes the true nature of the government and the system that we are fighting. And I think that will happen today too.
And so, when you put the news on, the dialogue is quite different from how our dialogue is going this morning. So a majority of people listen to the mainstream media and they don't hear Joe Lombardo and they don't hear Cynthia Pooler. What's going to change their minds?
Well, I think fewer and fewer people are listening to corporate media. I think they have
Okay.
problems with that. I think more and more people are getting their news through alternative media, including social media. And there is a crack. We all know the crackdown on social media. Their algorithms make my voice and your voice less heard by people, and they put us in little bubbles where we talk to each other rather than talk to the whole society, and they censor us all the time. I mean, every time I look at my page, something else has been censored. If I show a scene from Gaza, they say it's too violent, or they say they're going to stop people from responding to me for a period of time, and all these kinds of things. And I'm a little person. The bigger people have had all their media taken down, such as Scott Ritter or Chris Hedges or people like that. They took down years of work of their in just a stroke of these people because they don't want them to be heard. But we are being heard, and we're looking. People all the time are working on Signal or working on other social media platforms. Now they want to get rid of TikTok. Could you imagine if China said we're getting rid of Facebook or we're getting rid of YouTube or what all this? We would say that's undemocratic. But we want to get rid of TikTok. Why do they want to get rid of TikTok? Well, TikTok is one of the places where people are learning about the demonstrations and are going to these demonstrations and are learning an alternative narrative of what's going on. It has nothing to do with China. It has to do with the people that are on TikTok telling what their truth is and building these demonstrations. And so they want to stop it. Now, they want to stop it after the election because Biden doesn't want to be seen as the person who stops it because half of the population of the United States has TikTok accounts. So it's difficult to get out what we're saying and our words, but having visible demonstrations in the streets and at conventions, at graduations, and having encampments on the campuses and using social media and using all the resources that we have, they keep on trying to cut them back, is getting the word out. People have in the past in other countries have had to go underground, and yet they were still able to build their movement. And we will do what's necessary. We'll move forward in every way we can. And right now, in terms of the battle for people's hearts and minds, we are winning.
Wow, that's a pretty optimistic statement.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's true. They'll try to get us all to be down and not see that. But those people who are out in the streets and seeing something for the first time, even our little Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace Vigil has grown, has doubled in size since Palestinian stuff. There's Palestinian actions happening in Albany all the time. The little Palestinian Rights Committee has now become part of a bigger movement with a big listserv called Ceasefire now in the Capital District area. We had a student demonstration last week. People came down from SUNY Albany and marched in downtown Albany for Palestine. It's not, they'll tell us that we're all selfish and we only care about ourselves and who can, how much money we can make or something like that. But that's not the reality. We are human beings that have humanity, that have empathy for other people, and the things that bring us out in the biggest numbers are things like Palestine, where we see a genocide happening and we know we have to stop it.
So, Joe, as this drama unfolds, would you come back on Issues That Matter to talk about what's going on?
Sure, anytime.
Thank you. So you've been listening to Joe Lombardo. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. So if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Joe, thank you so much for your time this morning. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.